Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Gallo. I'm the librarian at the Assyrian Cultural Foundation's Ashurbanipal Library. I'm super excited to participate in the Nabu Circle lecture series, which marks the beginning of many more insightful lectures to come. Before I present our guest speaker for today, I'd like to provide you with some context regarding the purpose behind organizing the Nabu Circle lecture series. In the annals of ancient Assyria, the god Nabu was the lord of wisdom and revered as the patron deity of scribes and scholars, instilling within the heart of Assyrian civilization a profound veneration for knowledge and erudition. Under the benevolent gaze of illustrious rulers such as Ashurbanipal, a grand library arose in Nineveh, elevating the pursuit of scientific understanding to unprecedented heights. The Assyrian legacy of intellectual inquiry persisted, transcending epics and weaving its way into the fabrics of history as the Assyrians founded esteemed centers of learning, exemplified by the illustrious School of Nisibis, which propelled Islamic civilization into a golden age of enlightenment and progress. Enduring trials and tribulations, including the First World War, the Assyrian people clung to their unquenchable thirst for knowledge, allowing their love of learning to go undiminished. In the embrace of this noble tradition, the Nabu Circle lectures, initiated by the Assyrian Cultural Foundation, now serve as a platform for distinguished scholars to congregate to impart their insights into the annals of ancient history, literature, language, and culture, preserving and perpetuating the brilliance of a civilization forever marked by its profound love for wisdom. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Shana Zaia as our speaker. Dr. Zaia's topic for today's lecture is The Brothers' Conflict, the Assyrian Civil War of 652 BC. Dr. Shana Zaia is an assistant professor of ancient history in the Department of Art and Culture, History and Antiquity at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. She completed her PhD in Assyriology with distinction from Yale University, where she also earned her Master of Philosophy in Assyriology with a Comparative Semitic Languages minor. Dr. Zaia's research focuses on the interplay between royal power and official religious cult in Assyria from 1000 through 600 BCE. She has also taught in the Department of Religious Studies at Fairfield University and worked as the coordinator for writing advisors at the Graduate Writing Lab within the Yale University Center for Teaching and Learning. Additionally, Dr. Zaia has held various postdoctoral positions at institutions such as the University of Vienna and the University of Helsinki. She is affiliated with several academic projects in her field and has published numerous articles and book chapters on Assyrian religion and culture. After the lecture, we invite you to stay updated on the latest news and events of the Assyrian Cultural Foundation by following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. These lectures will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. I'll provide you with links to all our social media channels in the chat. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Robert De Caleta, who has played a vital role in coordinating all of these efforts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Very nice of you. And good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. We're really honored to have Dr. Zaia again with us, an Assyriologist. I just love saying that over and over again, who's been in teaching in Europe, and she is focused on some very interesting topics. And today's topic is extremely interesting because those of us who follow ancient Assyrian history tend to think of the fall as coming suddenly in 612 BC. So we're going to find out today whether that is true and what happened in the period before the great fall of Assyria in 612 BC and then subsequently. So with that, Dr. Zaia, we're really honored to have you again. And please go ahead. This is going to be extremely interesting.
Thank you both so much. So thank you, Sarah, for the lovely introduction, and Robert as well, and for inviting me again to speak here. I'm always happy to speak to this organization and to this audience. So as long as people want to keep learning about ancient Assyria, I am happy to be here to keep talking about it. I'm especially pleased to talk about this particular topic. It's near and dear to my heart. I have published a couple articles about Shamash-shuma-ukin, who will be one of the main protagonists or antagonist, depending on your perspective, of today's talk. So all of my publications are freely available on my website, so they're easy to find. But yeah, I'm very glad to see so many people here on a Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening, as it is the case for me in Amsterdam. I plan to talk about 45 minutes, maximum an hour. So I hope you'll bear with me and that you'll find it an interesting story. So before I begin, let me just make sure I can go. I do want to preface with all of the primary sources that I'm talking about, the actual texts I will provide you in translation. They are written in Akkadian, the most ancient written Semitic language. It was written in cuneiform script. You can find all of these inscriptions and others at several online projects and with English translations. So I strongly encourage you to check them out. Both Assyrian and Babylonian ones are available, and many others. And many images I'm using are coming from the British Museum's collection, which they've put quite a lot of it online with photos. So if you've never played around with their search function to see the Assyrian stuff they have, you can see quite a lot of the palace reliefs, which are very famous, and a lot of different written sources like tablets and cylinders and things like that. Great. But the topic for today is the Civil War from 652 to 648 between arguably one of the most famous Assyrian kings, Ashurbanipal, and his lesser-known brother, Shamash-shuma-ukin. But let's orient ourselves first to the geography and the time period that we're in. So we have to travel quite a long way back in time to the Neo-Assyrian period. That's basically the first half of the first millennium before our Common Era. This is when the empire really developed and took hold. It was a territorial kingdom before, and then it developed into an empire in this period. And you can see on the map on the slide how much it spread, especially during the later kings, who will be the focus of today's conversation. So as you know, Ashurbanipal was the last great Assyrian king. There were following kings after him, but they are not nearly as influential. But before we can jump into Ashurbanipal and his conflict with his brother Shamash-shuma-ukin, we need to think about his family history. So you might know that he belonged to the Sargonid dynasty. This is named after the founder of the dynasty, who is Sargon II. Sargon's son Sennacherib then became king after him, then Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon, and then Esarhaddon's son Ashurbanipal. These names are altered from their originals, so I've provided, just in case you're interested, the original Akkadian names for all of these kings, so that you can see what their names actually were and the years that they ruled over Assyria. So Sargon II founded this dynasty. He was a possible usurper. He might not have been meant to be the crown prince. He might have been nonetheless related to one of his forebearers, Tiglath-Pileser III, and his son Shalmaneser V took over after Tiglath-Pileser III, and then Sargon II came after Shalmaneser V. So what we see with the Sargonid dynasty is father to son progression, which is not always the case in the ancient world, but in this case, these are all fathers and sons. These kings are probably very familiar to you. You probably even know some people in your personal life named Sargon or Sennacherib, very popular names, very strong and powerful kings. So in order to understand the Civil War, and you might be wondering, why are we talking about the Sargonids? There's a lot of backstory and roots to this conflict that we need to understand before we can actually get to the war itself. So we actually have to go through the earlier history of the Sargonid dynasty, and actually even earlier than the Sargonid dynasty, because we need to talk about the Babylonian-Assyrian relations over the course of time. So you can see on this map here, this is Mesopotamia. There's not a clear line between the two, but you can see Babylonia is the south and Assyria is the north. They are always in this north-south divide. But there's also a long history of the two of them if not being united, then one controlling the other, usually Assyria trying to control Babylonia. So there's a long history of Assyria trying to take direct control of Babylonia or to annex it or absorb it. For many reasons, Babylonia had a very strong economy. They had good trading routes. They had a shared culture with them, the shared language, shared pantheon for the most part. They had a prestige. There was a lot of literature and texts and scholars who worked and lived in Babylonia. So we can say that there were many reasons for Assyrian kings to want to control Babylonia, but it was different from the other areas that Assyrian kings wanted to conquer. So unlike with other conquests, the Neo-Assyrian kings did not simply absorb the territory, but actually took on the local title as King of Babylon. So Babylonia is a name that we give it. It is not the Emic name. It's not the name that they would have used. So they would not call themselves King of Babylonia, but rather King of Babylon as the capital of Babylon, and therefore they controlled all of the south. So unlike with, say, the Levant, Assyrian kings did not take local titles there, but when they took over Babylonia, they would call themselves King of Babylon as well as King of Assyria. So there is this history of having a seat in both the north and the south. This really starts with Tiglath-Pileser III. He came before the Sargonids, as I mentioned. He wasn't the first king to conquer Babylonia, but he was the first to be recognized as king of Babylon in Babylonia, as well as king of Assyria in Assyria. And this really set the trend for the following kings, especially the Sargonid kings. Sargon II became king of Assyria and Babylonia, and his sons and grandsons wanted to follow suit. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always peaceful. There are many moments of Babylonian sort of independence movements, I suppose we can call them, and revolts or rebellions from certain cities or certain regions. But there's one particular moment in Assyrian-Babylonian relations that I want to highlight, and this is a major breakdown between the north and the south that happens under Sennacherib. He destroyed Babylon in 689 BCE and actually rejected the kingship. So he was king of Babylon and Assyria, but he ended up destroying Babylon and rejecting that title. So this didn't come out of nowhere, of course. The destruction of Babylon came after several years of escalating issues with the south. There were revolts. One of his Assyrian appointed governors was unseated. Usually in the case of territorial control, you have a local governor, and then if that doesn't work out, then you put in your own person. And then if that doesn't work out, then you annex that territory and just bring it into the empire. So after the Assyrian appointed governor was kicked out and the Babylonians went for independence, he actually put his crown prince, Ashur-nadin-shumi, as the governor of Babylonia, thinking that maybe this would be good training for him for when he becomes king of Assyria. Unfortunately, with a lot of strife and conflict, this kind of reached a boiling point when the Babylonians revolted and they allied with the Elamites, the neighbors in what's now Iran, and they took Ashur-nadin-shumi and they handed him over to the Elamites, where he was probably executed in Elam. So Sennacherib lost his crown prince, he lost his son, and it was an escalation that really seemed to have broken him in some way, and he went into full-on war with Babylon. This culminated with a major battle at Halule, a location on the Tigris, in 691, and he claims to have won there against a coalition of Babylonians led by a Chaldean king named Mushesib-Marduk, and they had allied with the Elamites, and some sources are not as clear on his victory, but he claims victory, and he does indeed then go on to siege Babylon for quite a long time. And Babylon falls, and then he claims, as you can see on this slide, to really create a lot of havoc there, that He had his people smash the gods, the Marduk statue, maybe even the Nabu statue, take all of the valuables, destroyed the city with fire, burned it down, removed the bricks, destroyed the temples, threw everything into the river. All of the buildings are made of essentially mud bricks, so water will dissolve them. So he actually he claims to dissolve the entire city and all of its monumental buildings. And he even says he made its destruction surpass that of the deluge, the big flood of mythology. So this was a really traumatic event for the Babylonians. They weren't in a hurry to forget that. And after that, as I mentioned, Sennacherib no longer considers himself king of Babylon, and even his successors don't call him king of Babylon when they mention him in their genealogies. Local sources say there was no king at this time. So basically, Babylon and all of Babylonia was dead to him. He didn't participate in any of the important rituals like the Akitu festival, and it was just not a place to talk about. But the thing is that all of this action and this approach to Babylonia by Sennacherib was all reversed by his son Esarhaddon, who made it actually a major point of his imperial policy to undo all of the actual damage and also the cultural and socio-political damages that Sennacherib had caused in Babylonia. So he came in and he rebuilt Babylon. He rebuilt the temple to Marduk. He attempted to return Marduk's cult image. There were some bad omens on the way, so he ended up not doing that. His sons would take that on instead. He stops talking about Sennacherib. He removes Sennacherib entirely from descriptions of what happened to Babylon, which is quite a bold strategy because this is still within people's lifetimes. They still remember what happened. But the way he tells it is Marduk was angry at the Babylonians and he commanded that the city be destroyed. And then the city was destroyed by somehow, but not by Sennacherib. He does not give his predecessor the credit for that. So he really made an effort to make people forget and to make people think that he's a very good king. He takes back on the king of Babylon title. He takes back on the position and all the responsibilities that are involved in it, including venerating Marduk, the patron god of the city Babylon and the most important god of the Babylonian pantheon. And he really strove to make himself the proper Babylonian king, chosen by the gods, legitimated by the gods, and aren't I so great? And let's all forget what happened with that last guy, and let's all be friends again. So this was a really big goal of Esarhaddon, that he wanted to undo what Sennacherib had done. So keep this in mind, that there were a lot of historical difficulties in controlling the region with governors, with officials, with local officials indirectly, and that Esarhaddon really wanted the two places to get along. So keep this in mind because it will be relevant later. There's another factor that we need to keep in mind as we lead up to the Civil War, and that's actually how Sennacherib died. I think it is pretty well known amongst this crowd that Sennacherib was assassinated by his sons, allegedly for choosing Esarhaddon as his crown prince. So the original crown prince was Ashur-nadin-shumi, the one who had been taken away and executed by the Elamites. That already caused quite a lot of complications and traumas there. But after that, it seems to have gone to a different son named Arad-Mulissu. And for some reason, he was demoted at some point, and Esarhaddon was made the crown prince, and this caused a lot of troubles amongst his brothers. The problem is we only have Esarhaddon's telling of this story. So we have to keep in mind to read this with that perspective, that it's Esarhaddon telling us what happened. So his version may be different from how one of the brothers might have told it. But as he describes it, essentially, he was the younger brother. It's not always the case that it's the eldest brother who becomes the crown prince, but in this case, he was the youngest brother, and Sennacherib decided to elevate him to the crown prince. And as you can see on the slide, this cylinder that he has described as his whole, or the prism that's depicted there, has this account of his rise to kingship that persecution and jealousy fell over my brothers. They forsook the will of the gods. They were plotting evil. They started rumors and slander, and they went out of their minds and did everything displeasing to the gods. And then they butted each other like kids, like baby goats, for the right to exercise kingship. But I, Esarhaddon, who does have the help of the great gods, who does not turn back in the heat of battle, I heard of their evil deeds. I mourned, I cried out, I raged like a lion, I became furious. This is the point of the assassination, and the way he's describing it. He was legitimately chosen by his father and his gods. The brothers were acting against the will of his father and against the gods, and this is an extremely traumatic event. He did succeed in the end, otherwise we wouldn't have this inscription, and he did take kingship in Assyria. As you'll see, the history is often written by the victors, and that's certainly the case here. We actually don't really know what happens to the brothers. They fled, and they may have been captured and executed. They may have simply stayed in exile, but this was a difficult and violent succession between one king to another, and that's important to note in the lead up to the Civil War. I do want to note that it's never explicitly written here how Sennacherib died, and we'll come back to that as well, because this will also be important later. It's also important to realize that if you're the king, the most dangerous people around you are the people closest to you, which we see play out time and time again. So we have these two things in particular. We have Esarhaddon's desire to have lasting and peaceful relations with Babylonia and to keep control in a effective way. And we have his complicated and violent and problematic succession that he had with the disputes of his brothers. So this led him to what was an extremely unusual and, in fact, a unique solution when it came time to naming his own heir to the throne. So these two factors in particular seem to have led him to appointing a split kingdom, a co-regency of two of his sons. So he appointed Ashurbanipal to be the future king of Assyria, and another son, probably an older son, in fact, Shamash-shum-ukin, as the king of Babylonia. So we don't know explicitly why he did that. These are my suppositions, considering the historical background to both Babylonia and his own personal succession story. But we do have some reactions from his scholars that this is an extremely unusual thing, that it has never been done before. And this is true because what we then end up with is a completely unique case where an Assyrian royal family member is appointed as the king of Babylonia with no intention that he would become the king of Assyria at any point. So even Ashur-nadin-shumi, Sennacherib's son, he was appointed in Babylonia with the expectation that he would have kingship over Assyria and Babylonia. So he seems to have wanted to maybe counteract Sennacherib's problems by having a legitimately installed Assyrian king, Assyrian royal family member in Babylon, dedicated to just Babylonian affairs, rather than splitting his attention between Assyria and Babylonia, and also having one of his sons in charge of Assyria. So they sort of split the oversight. He did this in 672. He would die a couple of years later en route to Egypt for a campaign. But at the time, he made everyone swear these really extensive treaties saying that they would absolutely protect Ashurbanipal as crown prince, that they would protect Shamash-shum-ukin as crown prince, and that they would always be loyal to them as kings. So he seems to have been anxious about succession with good reason. He's not the first or only king to have these treaties that he makes people swear, but the succession treaty that he has everyone around the empire, not just in the core, but also in the territories, it's quite an extensive document. So you can see a lot of anxiety behind it. So he has these two sons. He's appointed them to two different seats of power. He expects them to work together. You can see the two of them depicted here on steles that were found in Borsippa and Babylon, so in the south. One is Shamash-shum-ukin, he's the one on the left, and one is Ashurbanipal on the right. So they're doing the typical Babylonian basket-bearing, or the typical Southern basket-bearing image of the king as the builder carrying soil to build things. Okay, so this arrangement seems to have worked. It seems like Esarhaddon was not as crazy as his scholars thought he might have been in deciding to go down this path, because as far as we know, the years between 669 and 652 were actually pretty peaceful, and there was no significant problem between the two brothers. So we can take examples from the royal inscriptions of both of them, because we do have royal inscriptions from both. These are the long inscriptions that explain what the king did in each year, his campaigns, his building projects, other accomplishments that he's particularly proud of. And we can see from Ashurbanipal's inscriptions that he speaks quite highly of his brother. He says, I reestablished the privileged status of Babylon and appointed Shamash-shum-ukin, my favorite brother, to the kingship of Babylon in order that the strong might not harm the weak. And in this dedication to Marduk, he says, may the gods make my fate a long life and fullness of old age and good health and happiness. That's very standard. He also adds a blessing for Shamash-shum-ukin, which is unusual, saying, with regard to Shamash-shum-ukin, the king of Babylon, my favorite brother, may his days be long and may he be fully satisfied with his good fortune. Now, before I move on, I do want to point out, keep in mind that he has claimed in the first inscription that he had appointed Shamash-shum-ukin as king of Babylon. This will be important later. When we turn to Shamash-shum-ukin's inscriptions, they speak similarly well of Ashurbanipal. They use quite a lot of the same language. So there's another blessing formula. So in order to ensure the good health of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, my favorite brother, to prolong his life, to ensure the well-being of his descendants, to confirm his reign, and to defeat his enemy. And then he turns to himself with regard to me, to ensure my good health, to prolong my life, to ensure the well-being of my descendants, etc., etc. I had rebuilt the storehouses of the Azida temple and made them high as a mountain. And then he has a dedication for the god Shamash, the patron of Sippar, the sun god, where he also says, for the sake of his life, Shamash-shum-ukin's, and for the sake of the life of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, his favorite brother, he constructed this temple, and therefore they should both get the blessings. So far, the early years, they seem to be equally supporting each other and wishing each other well, and including each other in blessing formulae that usually only have to do with the king who actually did the rebuilding project himself. So they are going out of their way to talk about each other in a nice way. So that's nice. When we look at Shamash-shum-ukin's royal inscriptions, of which we have about 6, they're all from Babylonia, we do notice that there is something interesting about them. There's something very different about them. There's something different about him compared to Ashurbanipal. So I've put them all together here, Ashurbanipal's inscription in black and Shamash-shum-ukin's in red, so that you can see the difference in how they depict themselves as king. So Ashurbanipal depicts himself very much as a standard Assyrian king. He calls himself king of Assyria, Sharmat Ashur, literally king of the land of Ashur. And he talks about his relationship to the most important Assyrian gods, especially the state god Ashur, of course, not exclusively. He talks a lot about Mulissu and Ishtar as well, but he calls himself creation of the god Ashur and Mulissu. He claims that Ashur and Ishtar had nominated him for ruling over the land, or Shamash, Adad, and Ishtar, and that he has the support of Ashur and Ishtar, and he does things by the command of Ashur. Ashur is the most important state god, so of course the Assyrian king has to give him the top spot. So Ashurbanipal does that in pretty much all of his inscriptions. He also talks a lot about himself as a good shepherd, and he takes care of his people, and he's king of Assyria, etc., etc. But when we turn to Shamash-shum-ukin, he portrays himself much more as a Babylonian king. In the red, you can see he calls himself Shar-Babili, king of Babylon, and Shar-Shumeri-u-Akkadi, the king of Sumer and Akkad. This is what they called the southern area, Babylonia. He never mentions Ashur. This is extremely surprising because he is a member of the Assyrian royal family, but he is not the king of Assyria, so he never mentions Ashur. He instead talks a lot about Marduk, who has a similar role to Ashur, but for the Babylonians. He talks about Erua, who is Zarpanitum, Marduk's spouse, and he doesn't really mention Ishtar or Mulisu. Ishtar and Mulisu both heavily associated in the Assyrian pantheon with Arbela and Nineveh. So he prefers Marduk and Zarpanitu as his main, as his primary gods who support him, who nominate him for kingship, who make him legitimate, and who he turns to for support, and whose commands he follows. So he also calls himself a shepherd, but he calls himself the favorite of the gods Enlil, Shamash, and Marduk. These represent the major Babylonian cult centers, Nippur, Larsa, Sippar, Babylon. Very Babylonian oriented, very Babylonian in his portrayal. Basically, the only place where we really see that he is part of the Assyrian royal family is in his own genealogy, that he does call himself son of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria and king of Sumer and Akkad, grandson of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, not king of Sumer and Akkad. Remember, Sennacherib rejects the titles from Babylon. Descendant of Sargon II, king of Assyria and king of Sumer and Akkad, brother of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria. So it's very common that kings will talk about their genealogies, and he does do that, and he does not hide that he is from the Assyrian royal family, and he links himself with his predecessors, especially the ones who were kings of Babylonia as well. So far we have quite a nice story of two brothers ruling as neighboring kings, calling each other their favorite brother, doing nice things for each other, basically doing the best they can to embody their respective roles. Ashurbanipal very much as an Assyrian king, a king of Assyria, and Shamash-shum-ukin really embodying the Babylonian kingship. So that's going to affect also Shamash-shum-ukin's identity, perhaps, as we go on. But remember, not everything was rosy in the previous slides. I mentioned that Ashurbanipal claimed to have appointed Shamash-shum-ukin, and we saw that in the inscription. So this might be one of the first hints that there was tension between the two brothers, and this eventually would lead perhaps to the breakdown of their relationship. So Ashurbanipal is the more powerful king as king of Assyria. He has the more dominant seat. He has the more dominant position. He seems to have treated himself as if he was Shamash-shum-ukin's superior, not just claiming credit for appointing him, even though Esarhaddon is the one who clearly appointed him as the king of Babylon. But he also starts taking credit for things that Shamash-shum-ukin also claims to have done. Both kings claim that responsibility for the return of Marduk's statue to his temple in Babylon, which you can see a hypothetical reconstruction of the Isangil temple of Marduk in Babylon here with the ziggurat that's associated with it. This is the most important temple in Babylonia, so of course the king of Babylon has to especially take care of it. He also says that he built temples and other building projects that Shamash-shum-ukin also claims to have done. They quite often overlap. You can see that there is this letter from one of the officials in Babylonia, Urdu-aheshu. He writes to Ashurbanipal, and he basically shows in this letter that Ashurbanipal had commanded certain renovations of the Isangil temple of Marduk, and the king of Babylon has also given his own instructions for the enclosure wall and another temple in this complex, the temple of Belet Babili. So we can see that the two of them are starting to get in each other's way a little bit from time to time, and that Ashurbanipal is taking a lot of liberties in exerting his influence, being involved in the religious veneration, being involved in the politics in Babylon, being involved in the logistics of Babylon, and treating Shamash-shum-ukin as if he is a governor that he has appointed. So we can see some of the clash starting. We can see some tension starting. We can see maybe some breakdown in the dynamic between the two of them. So it's not ever explicitly said why the civil war broke out in 652, but I would suggest that this interference by Ashurbanipal and treating his brother as if he was dependent on him rather than the equally legitimately installed king of Babylonia was probably a factor in that. So we have no archives of letters from Shamash-Shummu king that we found so far. They might exist and we might not have found them. They might not exist. They might have been destroyed. We don't know. But we only have Ashurbanipal's voice and he doesn't talk about what happened. Nonetheless, we can maybe hypothesize that Shamash-Shummu king was frustrated as being treated as a secondary king or as a governor and not as the king of Babylon, who should have his own autonomy in the region. He might have internalized the Babylonian identity. As I mentioned, he really portrays himself as a king of Babylonia, and that might have in some way impacted his own way of thinking about himself and where he belongs and who his allies are. And he has started to ally with local groups in Babylon, and probably quite a lot who wanted independence, who were maybe even involved to some extent in the rebellions against Sennacherib previously. So remember, there's a long history of Babylonia trying to become independent from Assyria. So the impression we get does not seem to be that Shamash-Shummu king wanted to become king of Assyria. And this is a really important point because it does seem like he just wanted to break away with Babylonia from the Neo-Assyrian Empire, not that he was going to take over Assyria. All of the fighting happens in Babylonia. It's all allied revolts and rebellions in Babylonia. And he basically starts to build a coalition between Babylonians in several cities. And he allies with Umanigash, the king of Elam, who sends his army to help. So this is quite reminiscent of the war between Sennacherib and Babylonia, where the Elamites were also involved. They become quite a problem here and there for the Assyrians. But essentially, this seems to have been an independence movement. But everything we know from the Civil War comes from Ashurbanipal's inscriptions, because we simply don't have Shamash-Shummu king's side of the story. And yeah, spoiler alert, Ashurbanipal wins the Civil War, so we have only the victor's side of the story. And Shamash-Shummu king really might have written something, but we just don't have them. As I mentioned, we only have about 6 royal inscriptions from him left, and they're all about building projects and things like that. But from Ashurbanipal's descriptions, he does talk about this conflict, again, from his perspective. So what he writes portrays Shamash-Shummu king as an ungrateful brother whose position is completely due to the generosity of Ashurbanipal. You can see on the first paragraph that he calls him my unfaithful brother. He's no longer the favorite brother, for whom I performed so many acts of kindness and installed as king of Babylon. And I gave him everything. I gave him soldiers and horses and chariots, and I gave him cities and fields, more than anyone else who had ever had before. But he forgot these acts of kindness that I had done for him, and he constantly sought out evil, kind of like Sennacherib or Esarhaddon's brothers when they were plotting to assassinate Sennacherib. And he was speaking friendship aloud, but deep down his heart was scheming for murder. He lied to the citizens of Babylon who had been devoted to Assyria, servants who belonged to me, and he spoke words of deceit with them. So he portrays his brother as taking people away from the kindness of Ashurbanipal. And he also claims that he cut off their alliance. It was his fault. And he even cruelly denied him the ability to venerate the gods of Babylonia in their temples in the south. Many of these were shared in the larger Assyro-Babylonian pantheon. And despite the fact that Ashurbanipal was a patron of these centers with many renovations that came at great expense with gold and silver, so he put a stop to our brotherly relations. He withheld the performing of my offerings, and he deprived me of the cult centers, the sanctuaries I had renovated and decorated with gold and silver. Again, Shamash-Shummu king claims to renovate a lot of these himself. So we can see a lot of the rewriting of history here. Now, his descriptions of the war portray it entirely as a rebellion and the rejection of the treaty that Esarhaddon had made everyone swear to support Ashurbanipal as king of Assyria. That's what he's referencing. They do confirm that Shamash-shum-ukin was able to build a coalition amongst the several Babylonian regions. Again, he called them in the previous slide that they were servants who had belonged to me, so he sees it as an act of betrayal. He uses similar language for Umanigash, this king of Elam, who allies with Shamash-shum-ukin, and he claims that his brother actually bribed the king of Elam to fight with him, and not that he might have actually wanted to help, but that he was bribed to do so, and that he got involved in this. But nonetheless, he claims unequivocal military successes against his brother's army in many important cities in Babylonia. And he does not admit at any point that he is defeated in any way in any battle. So we only have this depiction of he's very successful in pushing down this rebellion. So you can see that he has switched how he talks about Shamash-shum-ukin, and he uses many new terms after the war breaks out. No more the favorite brother, but rather he calls him my hostile brother Ahu-Lakenu, or Ahu-Nakru, my enemy brother, Nakri, my enemy, or even La-Ahu, a no brother. So he completely changes the way he talks about their relationship. And he even accuses him of planning to destroy him and Assyria. He had planned murder against Assyria and uttered blasphemies against the god Ashur himself, the most important imperial god. As he's disowning Shamash-shum-ukin as his brother, in a letter to some of his remaining Babylonian allies, as he tries to convince them not to join Shamash-shum-ukin's rebellion, he starts to use brotherly language with them instead, and he tries to claim that he's the one who has their best interests at heart, not Shamash-shum-ukin. So he says, the words of wind, so these lies, this nothing that this no brother has spoken to you has been relayed to me. This is a letter that the Babylonians had received. It's nothing but a scheme that he's devised in order to make the name of the Babylonians who love me detestable along with him. Your brotherhood with the Assyrians and your privileged status which I have established remains valid until the present day. You are close to my heart. So we can see that he pushes the family relationship with Shamash-shum-ukin away and builds it instead with the Babylonians, who he tries to convince they are better allied with him than with Shamash-shum-ukin. So the major turning point in the war is the death of Shamash-shum-ukin. As you might imagine, this took a lot of the wind out of the sails of this rebellion or civil war, or however you would like to describe it. How he died is actually not very clear, and this is quite an important point. So what we have from Ashurbanipal's inscriptions are just that he died in a fire. It destroyed him. His body burned. The important point to note in these inscriptions is that it's not Ashurbanipal killing him. It's not an army killing him. It's not a soldier. It's not even his own people turning against him. It's the gods. Ashur determined for him a cruel death. He consigned him to a fire and destroyed his life. In another inscription, there's a whole list of gods who send him to the fire. In another one, there's a couple gods, Enlil, probably Mulissu, and Marduk, who looked upon his evil deeds, and they made the fire god grasp his hands and had his body burned. So that's not actually, of course, how Shamash-shum-ukin died. We're not sure, though, if he was killed, assassinated, or died by suicide. Fire seems to have been involved, but it's important that Ashurbanipal depicts this as something the gods did to him. In many cases with violating treaties and treason, the gods smite the person who has violated the agreement because the agreement was sworn before them, so they are the ones who bring the punishment. But nonetheless, we have the gods as the executioners in Shamash-shum-ukin's case, and we even have a letter from the god Ashur himself to Ashurbanipal responding to the civil war. There are some letters to and from the gods. That's their own genre of text. And in this case, Ashur takes credit for removing Shamash-shum-ukin from kingship, bringing the curse of death upon him, which he in fact brought him upon himself by violating the curse and committing evil deeds against both the god Ashur and Ashurbanipal. And Ashur claims that these actions cost Shamash-shum-ukin his life. He forfeited his life by doing this. So his own gods become angry and abandon him, and Ashur then enables Ashurbanipal to succeed in the war. So again, it's probably important to note here that, again, we don't know exactly how Shamash-shum-ukin died, but that the gods were behind it. And there are different theories about his death, whether he was killed by Ashurbanipal's army. Ashurbanipal didn't usually go out with his army, so it would have been one of his soldiers or commanders. He might have been assassinated by one of his own officials to end the war. By now it had been going on for 4 years and really was devastating to the Babylonians. Or he may have in fact died by suicide in a fire. These are all theories that we have. But the important point to note here is that this is really different from how the deaths of enemy kings are usually described in Ashurbanipal's inscriptions, which do talk explicitly about all of these things. Foreign and enemy kings being killed by Assyrian soldiers or by the king himself, or their own officials killing them, or dying by suicide when they cannot win. These are all things that are very explicitly talked about, usually in the Assyrian royal inscriptions, when it comes to enemy kings. What this is similar to is how Esarhaddon talks, or rather doesn't talk, about the assassination of his father Sennacherib. So let's take a look again at Esarhaddon's description, where he never actually says what his brothers did, but talks around it, that they were plotting evil, that they took up their weapons, that the gods saw the deeds of the usurpers which had been done wrongly against the will of the gods, and they did not support them. I quickly heard of their evil deeds, and I cried out in mourning, and I rent my priestly garment. That's the assassination. That's as close as he gets to describing the death of Sennacherib. We can contrast this to the biblical account in 2 Kings 19, which is not written from an Assyrian perspective, and it explicitly describes the assassination, that as King Sennacherib went back to Nineveh, and as he was worshiping in the house of his god Nisroch, probably Nergal, his sons Arad Melech, that's Ardu Melissu, and Sharezer killed him with the sword, and then they escaped into the land of Ararat. His son Esarhaddon succeeded him. This is very explicit, and some of it is quite historically accurate, very summarized, of course, but it's not how the Assyrians describe the death of an Assyrian king. And in fact, the uncertainty of how Shamash-shum-ukin actually died is part of a larger trend in how Assyrian texts avoid talking about the death specifically of Assyrian kings, which stands to reason. The unexpected death of a king was extremely traumatic, and it implied that he had been abandoned by his gods, which means there's questions about him being the legitimate king and what he has done to alienate the gods. And this would also go against everything in how Assyrian texts and art, like palace reliefs, depict the king as an unstoppable heroic warrior, someone who cannot be defeated, someone who always wins. So while enemy kings' deaths are described sometimes in quite gruesome detail in order to show the might of the kings, all of the Assyrian kings die off screen as far as the official record goes. They never talk about it, especially if it's a traumatic death. So you can contrast this silence about Assyrian kings' deaths also in the depictions in art. So you can see on the slide, this is the famous banquet scene from Ashurbanipal's palace in Nineveh, kept in the British Museum now, where you can see Ashurbanipal and his queen are enjoying a very nice meal in the garden. But if you look closely at the tree all the way to the left, you can see the disembodied head of Teumman, one of the kings of Elam, is hanging there. After defeating Teumman and executing him, Ashurbanipal actually paraded his corpse around the empire as part of a military triumph. So they are not shy about the death of kings, but they are not willing to talk about the death of their own kings. So with that in mind, how Ashurbanipal depicts Shamash-shum-ukin's death in his palace reliefs is very noticeably different from how enemy kings are portrayed. So if you think about poor Teoman's head hanging from a tree in the garden, you can see in this palace relief, also from Ashurbanipal's palace in Nineveh, that Ashurbanipal's army is receiving the royal crown and staff of Babylon and Shamash-shum-ukin's cylinder seal, which is an extremely personal object. And these are what signify Shamash-shum-ukin's death and defeat, rather than showing it. We don't see Shamash-shum-ukin burning in a fire. We don't see someone executing him. He's not subjected to the humiliations that other enemy kings are, but the message is still clear that he is deceased. Ashurbanipal attributing it to the gods as well, rather than any mortal person, means that he also distances himself in the texts. So Shamash-shum-ukin at this point is simply erased, and he's never mentioned again in any Assyrian texts. As you can see with this close-up of the basket-bearing stele that I showed you earlier, his face is literally cut away. We're not sure when that happened, but it would be consistent with the idea of erasing him from history. And what we should take away from this is that despite the civil war and the breakdown of the relationship between the brothers, Shamash-shum-ukin was still very much considered a member of the Assyrian royal family and a legitimately installed king. So his death was treated the same way as an Assyrian king's death would be. So, yes, and of course, this death was very traumatic for Ashurbanipal. So no matter what the circumstances, this was his brother. Killing your own brother was not something that was culturally acceptable and something that would have been very problematic for Ashurbanipal, and not something that he could ever discuss as a victory in the same way as with other kings that he defeated. But with the death of Shamash-shum-ukin, the civil war very soon came to an end. According to Ashurbanipal's inscriptions, the people at the higher levels of the rebellion, who Ashurbanipal now even claims had incited his brother to rebel, starting to excuse his brother a little bit after the fact, that those who had somehow survived the war were captured and then executed. We know in Nineveh from the letter from Ashur that they were executed in Nineveh. But the rest of the Babylonians had suffered massively during the sieges from plagues and famines and the usual things that happen when you're holed up in a city with a lot of other people and you have no access to food or water. To them, he showed mercy. He showed mercy to those who did not support Shamash-shum-ukin, to those who had supported Shamash-shum-ukin but weren't at the higher levels. He put a new Assyrian appointed governor and official over them. He subdued them by imposing taxes and corvée labor upon them, the same way that he would do to a conquered foreign land, so any other territory that the Assyrians would have taken. But after that, basically the civil war ended, and it seems to have been relatively quiet in Babylonia after that, although you can see from the slide where I'm heading, I think, with this, so it wasn't unproblematic. But in the immediate aftermath, Ashurbanipal took back the kingship of Babylon in addition to Assyria. He called himself King of Babylon again, and he installed a puppet ruler named Kandalanu in Babylon to rule on his behalf. But the thing is that even though it was relatively stable, the cracks were already there and they were quite long-lasting, and they only got bigger over time. Over the course of the war, it lasted 4 years. It had cost a huge amount in resources and human lives, and it probably caused quite a lot of instability, especially the idea of neighbors fighting against each other. Even within Babylonia, there were some pro-Assyrian factions and some anti-Assyrian factions, so this caused a lot of problems. But this probably contributed to the gradual decline of the empire. Not immediately, but of course, it's hard to recover from something like this. This also did not stamp out the desire for Babylonian independence. Soon after Ashurbanipal's death, a Babylonian official in Uruk, who probably had worked for the Assyrians, we all probably know his name. His name was Nabu. He actually was able to take power in the south just after Ashurbanipal died. We don't know when exactly that was, either 630 or 629 or 627. And taking advantage of this instability and this desire for Babylonian independence, and also a power vacuum that the Elamites had left because the Assyrians did finally manage to defeat Elam. The Medes moved in. There was a power vacuum. Nabopolassar was able to form a coalition between Babylonians, and he was a Chaldean himself. So he managed to form a rather large coalition with people living in the south, Medes, other groups like Scythians and Cimmerians, and he declared war on Assyria. From that point, Assyria as an empire collapsed rather rapidly. So there were other problems clearly in its structure and how overextended it was. And of course, whenever a king dies and a new king takes over, that's a very vulnerable point because there is this transition of power. But basically, Nabopolassar and his army of Babylonians and Medes and other groups rolled through the Assyrian territory and systematically disassembled it, essentially. So Nineveh fell in 612 and was destroyed. Ashur fell in 610 and was destroyed. The king at the time who had taken over after Ashurbanipal and all of the successors were very short-lived. But the king at the time of this war was Sinshar Ishkun, and he actually died in battle. His successor was Ashurbanipal II, who ran to Haran in what's now Turkey, and he ruled in exile. Haran fell in 609, and Ashurbanipal was killed there. So that was the official end of the Assyrian Empire. And at that point, Nabopolassar founded the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which you can see in green on the map. That it had absorbed all of the former Assyrian territories. But very briefly, this is not the end of the story for the Civil War, which is quite interesting. It lived on in later sources and in cultural memory. There's two sources in particular that I want to mention very briefly. One is Ctesias's Persica. He was a Greek historian active in the 5th century BCE, so a couple hundred years after the war. His work is lost. It's preserved in the work of another historian, Diodorus Siculus. And this is where the myth of Sardanapalus comes from. So this is the story of an Assyrian king, often interpreted to be Ashurbanipal. He's living a life of excess. He went to war with a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Persians. And then when it was clear that they would win and he would lose, and they were besieging Nineveh, Sardanapalus created a funerary pyre for himself, his royal court, all his possessions, and then set it on fire to die from his own agency. So it does seem to have been influenced by kind of a mashup of the Civil War, because Shamash Shumukin's death by fire seems to have been preserved in memory, although this is very clearly suicide and attributed to Ashurbanipal. And it takes points from the fall of Assyria. Again, it's not a very historically accurate document. There's no evidence to suggest that there was a king called Sardanapalus or that Ashurbanipal was especially into excess and luxury and things like that. But this did seem to have captured the imagination. You can see an even more modern retelling of this in the form of this painting by Eugène Delacroix, The Death of Sardanapalus. It's not the only thing that has come out of Ctesias's work, but this does depict the moment of collecting everyone to die in a funerary pyre on purpose. This French artist was specifically inspired by Ctesias, which then also inspired other things like a play by Lord Byron called Sardanapalus, which was in 1821, so around the same time, and an opera by Liszt, Sardanapalo, around 1845-ish. So at this point in the arts world, this was very much a story that was being told and retold. But again, this one is rather far from the Civil War, and what seems to have captured the imagination is the idea of Shamash Shumukin dying as a suicide by fire. Papyrus Amherst 63 is much closer, and I think this crowd will be much more interested in this text. It's an Aramaic text, unusually written in the Demotic script found in Egypt and Elephantina from around the 6th century BCE, so much closer to the events of the Civil War, found in a Jewish community where many other things were found, many other writings. It's a much closer retelling of the Civil War. Again, it has this suicide by fire aspect that both of them share. But the story goes that there's a king of Babylon, Sarmuga. I guess you can sort of hear where Shamash Shumukin might have become Sarmuga, but it takes a little bit of creativity. But he rebels against his brother, Ashurbanipal, very close to the other name for Ashurbanipal in the Greek sources, the Sardanapalus. They have this strife between them. There's a war that breaks out. Their sister goes to Babylon to beg Sarmuga to return to Nineveh and to make everything right with his brother, because there's no way he will win against him, because Assyria will certainly win in this conflict. He refuses, and she claims, in frustration, she tells him that this is complete futility and the Assyrian army will come to destroy him and everything he cares about. So he might as well set everything on fire, himself, his family, all his possessions inside it, on his own. Out of frustration. She probably didn't mean it, but she goes back, and an Assyrian general comes to Babylon also to persuade him to end the war. Excuse me. And he warns him that his brother is planning to retaliate very harshly. So this seems to have pushed Sarmuga to create an actual funeral pyre and to burn himself and his family to death. So even though we don't know how Shamash Shumukin actually died, this idea of fire seems to have gone on in the later sources. But the thing that's interesting about the later sources is that because they are not written by the Assyrians, excuse me, it's quite dry in here. It's not written by the Assyrians, so they don't need to protect themselves from the complicated emotions and the problematic feelings around fratricide and patricide and things like that. They're actually much more free with the complicated feelings that were behind this brotherly strife. So of course, it's not easy to fight against your own brother. It's not easy to have to deal with these topics. And what I like about the Papyrus Amherst 63 is that it ends with a really poignant moment of the brotherly relationship coming back out. What we miss in the Neo-Assyrian documents of the care that they have for each other does come back out in this Aramaic text, that by now the Shamash Shumukin character has died. The general comes back to the king and tells him what has happened. And the king says, if you still have some compassion, turn your face to me, come to the palace, because I said to you, let them slay Babylon, but spare my brother. So in the very end of this conflict, this papyrus captures this complicated and very touching moment where the king is devastated by the loss of his brother and separates out this identity of his brother from his political identity as the rebellious king of Babylon, that Babylon could have fallen, but you could have at least spared my brother.